Hello and welcome to another Jabava London game. So this game review will feature Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces versus Guha Mitrabha, I believe an Indian grandmaster. So the moves in the opening for this Jabava London are a little bit different. So we'll see how Magnus Carlsen handles a little out of the ordinary opening by his opponent. So the game begins with d4, and now we have knight to f6. So these are common moves. If you're not familiar with the Jabava London, usually white will play d4, knight to c3, bishop to f4, and get that kind of set up and then go from there. So his opponent, now here Magnus Carlsen played f4, bishop to f4 first. So those moves, you can change the order a little bit. His opponent plays b6, which is maybe not as common as d4. Sometimes maybe even c5 would be played. So this move is not quite as common. So let's see how Magnus responds to this. So knight to c3, just continuing this Jabava London setup. And now we have the bishop fianchettoing here to b7, which was the point of b6, of course, to put the bishop here and aim it down through the center towards the king side. Now, how does Magnus respond to this? Well, he plays f3. So this is a good move. It blunts the scope of the bishop, helps guard this e4 square. It also keeps the knight from moving forward. And in the Jabava London, a lot of times this bishop on b7 will instead develop to f5. And one thing that you can do is play f3 in that case as well, because then you could push the g pawn and chase back this bishop if it goes to f5. And then you kind of have a pawn storm moving towards black's king side. But in this game, we have d5. So now, a common move preventing or maybe discouraging a little bit white from playing e4 here. Now the d pawn could capture, although this f pawn now would be able to recapture, giving Magnus Carlsen a strong pawn center. So before that happens, the pushing of this e pawn, we have knight to b5. So another common move in the Jabava London, and the immediate threat behind this move is the fact that the knight and the bishop are piling up on this pawn here and threatening a capture of the pawn, forking the king and the rook. So this pretty much forces black to make a decision. How is he going to stop this? Well, knight to a6. So this move you could also see a lot, or maybe not a lot, but it's not infrequent in the Jabava London setup. So the knight is covering here, preventing the fork. And the game continues with g4. So because f3 is played, it allows g4, pushing this pawn towards the king side and possibly chasing the knight here. So now we have e6. So Magnus Carlsen's opponent ignores this g pawn and instead plays e6 to get ready to develop his dark squared bishop. So now we have e3. So this is also a common move in the Jabava London. And the reason that you do this, well, one, it backs up your bishop in case that bishop is attacked. If it's captured, the e pawn could recapture and end up on f4, And then along with the d pawn, you could have a good lockdown on this e5 square. But also e3 fortifies this d pawn. So a lot of times the c pawn might move forward, possibly try to capture here on d4, and then the e pawn can recapture and kind of be used as an anchor here in the center, around which play will revolve. So now we have c6 being played. So chasing the knight retreats back, and then the game continues with bishop to d6. Something else that is common, the bishop moves to d6 and basically confronts this bishop on f4. So, what does Carlsen do? Should he capture? If he doesn't capture, well, then black may capture his pawn, or excuse me, his bishop, and then the pawn will recapture. And like I said, white would end up with this f pawn and d pawn locking down this e5 square. So the game continues with queen to d2. So if there is an exchange here on f4 and the pawn recaptures, well, now the queen would be guarding that pawn that ends up on f4. Also keeping an eye on the d pawn, and the king can also castle queenside here, as the king side has been kind of pushed forward, leaving gaps in the defenses. All right, so queen to e7, creating a battery of queen and bishop, but protecting the bishop in case white decides to capture. So the game continues with Magnus castling queenside, and now we have a battery up through the center. Although the center is blocked, if it opens up, then this could be possibly a strong battery of rook and queen here. So the game continues with this knight, which is poorly placed and not needed here, on a6, of course, now that the bishop and knight are not aiming at c7. So the knight retreats back, getting ready to maybe reposition towards the center after the game progresses there. Of course, that's not possible at this point because of all these pawns. So the game continues with a capture of the bishop. So we have an exchange of Carlsen's bad bishop, which was blocked by pawns on the same color squares in the center, trading for the good bishop of blacks, which was on the opposite colored squares. So now we see white has this good bishop that can move more freely compared to this really blocked in bishop here. So the game continues with e4. So Carlsen decides to go ahead and gain space in the center. He may be able to capture in the center and try and open things up a little bit while this king is still in the center. So we have a capture of the e-pawn, and now a recapture. And then the game continues with the queen retreating back here because there was a threat possibly of, would that be a threat of this pawn? I guess it's a possible threat of forking the queen and the knight. Now Magnus will have to keep an eye on this bishop as well, because once this pawn, or if this pawn moves forward, there could be a pushing of the c pawn, and then the bishop will have this diagonal, which is aiming, the bishop is aiming down towards this h1 rook, which is kind of blocked in here. So moving forward, the queen retreats, and now Magnus just pushes this pawn forward, attacking the knight. So the knight retreats back, and then this knight jumps forward. So Now the rook will have more room to move if it needs to. But of course, that knight wasn't doing much back there. So a lot of times in this Jabava London, the knight will either move up to f3 or sometimes over to e2 as well. And so the game continues with a queenside castling. So Carlsen's opponent didn't want the game to get too wild, so he castles on the same side. So when you have same side castling, things tend to be a little calmer. If he would have castled to the king side, Magnus already has a pawn pushed forward pretty good. There's an open F file here. So queenside castling was probably better. And now this rook lands on a half open file as well. And it's lined up on the queen. So the game continues with h4. Magnus just pushing forward, fortifying this G pawn, gaining space on the king side there, and h6. So, if this pawn captures, of course the h pawn can't capture or the rook will capture. So what does Carlsen do? He blocks a possible attack on his rook with the bishop, so gets this bishop off the back rank, and the bishop is lined up on the king here. Now, once I go through this game, I'll do a quick game review afterwards and then some analysis if you want to look at things more in depth and dig a little bit deeper into this game. So I'll try and keep this moving along a little faster here. So capture, recapture, the pawn captures towards the center, of course. And now this H file is opened up for the rooks. The king moves off of the line of the bishop here in case these pawns need to move, and this knight, of course. So the game continues with queen to f4. So, kind of centralizing the queen, getting the queen off of the line of fire of this rook on d8. And now, also the queen is lined up on the king, lined up on this f pawn on an open file or half open file in case a rook may want to slide in here behind the queen and threaten to attack perhaps at some point. So knight moving forward for Carlsen and an attack on the knight and the pawn. So pawn captures. Carlsen has gotten rid of his isolated pawn here. After recapture, the knight must make a decision on what to do here. So we have just a retreat back, and now this pawn is being piled up on by queen and knight here. So the game continues with knight to d7 protecting the pawn along with the queen. And now Magnus repositions this knight, which is not doing much attacking this pawn anymore. And the game continues with e5. So attacking the queen and pawn on d4. So the game continues with a queen retreat. And now capture, recapture. The knight jumps forward to this outpost and blockades the isolated pawn. And now we have Magnus jumping his knight forward, attacking the queen. So both sides are blockading an isolated pawn on an outpost. They put the knight on an outpost, which basically you place your knight where it cannot be attacked by pawns, and you're also blocking the pawn in front of your knight, preventing it from trying to move forward. Because once you lock that pawn down and prevent it from moving, it becomes an easier target. So now the queen, which was under attack, lines up on Magnus's king here and also attacks the rook with his rook. And we have, if this rook moves, the queen could be captured as well. So capture with check. Rook captures, but now Magnus captures black's queen and forces him to double pawns. So a weakness has been created on the queen side here for Magnus's opponent. It looks like his pawn structure is broken, so this will be a target area for Magnus possibly. So the game continues with bishop retreat, and now the bishop is moving to another diagonal. It was kind of blocked in by the knight, especially if that knight plans on staying there. Here, the bishop retreats back and aims up this diagonal. So we have a bishop maneuver by black here, aiming at the knight. And so the knight just steps back, and this knight moves forward, perhaps with designs of jumping up to d4 or f5, or excuse me, f4 or g5. So rook attacking this unprotected pawn. We have a rook defending, and the knight jumps to the edge of the board. Now, normally it's not good to move to the edge of the board, but here Magnus is eyeing this eyeing this protected pawn, and perhaps later he can pile up on this pawn and try to capture it. So king moving towards the center, which is always important in endgames. As you transition from the middle game to the end game, remember to use your king if you can, as long as you can do so safely, because the king can be another attacking or defending piece. It can be very important in the end game. So now we have b3. So along with this knight on e3, the pawn and the knight kind of prevent this pawn from moving. Like I said, if you can stop a pawn from moving forward, it becomes an easier target of attack. So bishop moves up, king moves up, and now the bishop retreats back to reposition possibly to another diagonal and maybe go after this pawn on e4, which is not protected at the moment. So the knight jumps forward, targeting black's knight. So what happens here? The knight moves away and attacks the rook. So now Magnus decides to retreat his rook back and counterattack the knight. So the knight just steps back to where it was, but after capture, now the pawns are blocking each other. They're kind of prevented from moving forward. It's a more, static position now that the pawns are not able to move. They can become easier targets. So bishop up to c4, attacking the knight. Knight jumps forward. And now we have rook on the 7th rank targeting the king and possibly this pawn. So the king moves up, but instead of going after the pawn, Magnus attacks the king, pushing this king back so that the king will not be able to come up in the end game and perhaps assist in attacking or defending this pawn here. So now we have the knight jumping forward, blockading this pawn, and let's see where this knight is going. So rook to f2. So black jumps his rook up to the 7th rank, and black's 7th rank, and piles up on this pawn. So we have an unprotected pawn that's now being attacked. The king is protecting the pawn. So 2 attackers, 1 defender. What happens? So instead of worrying about defending here, Magnus attacks capturing a pawn with check. And so the king, steps down here, helping protect this pawn as well. Maybe trying to move forward here in the future. But he kind of gets out of the line of fire, although this rook is lined up here on the pawn. So now we have, the rook's lined up on the pawn and the king. The bishop drops back to help defend. Now we have the knight repositioning and rook pinning the knight to black's rook. So now this knight cannot move or the rook will be captured. So now we have the bishop helping protect this knight, and Carlsen moves his knight to d8, piling up with his rook on this pawn here, which is pinned to the king. So the king moves, but we have a capture. Rook repositions, wanting to get out of that pin by the rook on the knight. So capture of another pawn. So I don't know, it's not looking good for Magnus's opponent. And Magnus Carlsen is known for this, just grinding his opponents down in the end game, accumulating small advantages until they become big, until he has bigger advantages enough to win. So here we have an attack, a little threat of capturing the bishop, and the pawn would not be able to recapture because it's pinned to the king by this rook. So here, once again, Magnus ignores this attack for the moment, counterattacks, bringing his knight back into the game with a check. The king heads towards the rook, and now the king moves up, getting out of that pin on this pawn. So black adds more pressure to the pawn with the bishop here. So now we have knight to a3, helping fortify this pawn, and the king attacks Magnus's rook here. So the rook moves down, attacking this unprotected knight. So we have capture, capture, rook captures pawn, and now the knight retreats here. So instead of going after the bishop and allowing the rook to capture and just trading pieces down, which would be a little more drawish with just rooks on the board. If you keep a knight on the board, it's less likely to be a draw, especially with knights being very tricky, being able to fork and harass the opponent and his pieces. So check, and now the king moves forward. So the game continues with bishop to e2, attacking this pawn, and a counterattack. So once again, Magnus ignores the attack that his opponent has and counterattacks with his own strike against this e5 pawn. So capture, capture with check. King moves forward, attacking the rook, and the rook moves up to e8 here. And then here is where the game ended. So, either they ran out of time, as this was a 3-minute blitz game with 2 seconds added after each move. So, if we look at this, this pawn could move forward here. And I don't know, it's pretty tricky. We'll have to take a look and see what the computer analysis says. But now when I go ahead and do the game review, which I'm going to do now, for some reason they updated the game review recently, I think on chess.com, and it looks like it deletes the names of the players here. So just remember, of course, that Magnus has the white pieces. and his opponent is playing black. So I'm going to hit the game review. All right, so in this game, Magnus Carlsen played at 87% versus his opponent's 85.2. So, because it's a blitz game, they're going to have more inaccuracies, possible mistakes. So it looks like, let's take a look at that. They each had one great move. Mistakes. Magnus had one, his opponent had three. Inaccuracies, Magnus had 6, his opponent had 7. And then Magnus had 3 misses, and his opponent had 2. So no blunders. But look at this. So Magnus played at a 3250 level, his opponent played at a 3000 level. All right. So let's start this review. Before I do, one other thing. Opening accuracy, 91 for Magnus and 88.9 for his opponent. Middle game, 89.7 versus 85.7. And then end game, 77.1 versus 81.6. So his opponent played apparently a little bit more accurate in the end game. So the review. Now, d4 was played, and then the game continued with knight to f6. And the Jabava London, as I said, you can just play knight to c3 first instead of bishop to f4. These moves are kind of interchangeable. It depends what your opponent does as well. You want to keep an eye on what they're doing, and you might have a preference for one or the other, bishop to f4 first or knight to c3 first. Maybe this bishop to f4 move is more flexible because you could go into a regular London instead of the Jabava London, and you could also push this pawn up to c4 possibly, and jump your knight in behind here. So we have knight to c3, so the Jabava London setup, and then the bishop fianchetto. So this is a little different. I'm learning the Jabava London system, and I haven't played this variation where they bring their bishop here to b7 like this. But, Magnus, the best player in the world, so, there's probably a good reason for him playing f3 here. It blocks the scope of the bishop, helps guard e4, and, he can push this pawn up to e4 instead of e3 where it sometimes goes. It usually goes to e3, but his opponent plays d4 here. So, this is why Magnus didn't play e4 and allow black to kind of exchange in the center. So the game continues. Now the computer actually prefers an immediate e4 here, but I'm not going to go into that. Let me just blast through these moves. So once again, computer says knight to a6 is a good move because, of course, you have to stop this fork. The capture of the c-pawn by the knight, and it's backed up by the bishop. You don't want to fall into the trap of being forked on c7, attacking the rook and the king. So moving on, we have kind of the beginning of a pawn storm on the king side for white. So black probably does not want to castle over there. And now a confrontation between the two bishops, so another common theme in the Jabava London. And you don't necessarily have to capture here. You probably want to leave your bishop here, and then if black captures you, you don't have to be afraid of these doubled pawns, because if this e-pawn goes to f4, it'll help prevent this e-pawn moving to e5. And that would be even better if the bishop was stuck over here on c6 and really blocked in. But even here, because of these two pawns, the bishop's pretty blocked in there. So queen to d2, computer does not like that. It says capturing would be better. But, that just helps assist black in developing the queen towards the center. So why help black develop? Instead, Magnus develops his queen. All right, so another queen move here that the computer doesn't like. What does it say is best? Instead, threaten to attack in the center. So if the pawn captures, you can capture, but black probably didn't want to do that because he wants to castle queenside. And if the center is broken open, he would have to castle kingside, where it's a little more open, and these pawns have moved forward. So let me go back here. All right, so we had a capture, and then the queen moved back. So it looks like maybe you could capture this pawn, but then the queen could attack, move up here, attack, and then maybe go after this pawn and the rook. Although he would have to watch out that this knight doesn't jump back to here. So maybe you would want to go here and attack the knight and drive that knight back, and then possibly go after the G pawn. Anyway, let's hurry up and finish this game review, and then I'll go over the analysis with the computer and see what happens. Man, it's really blasting through these moves. Okay, so a mistake here. Best would have been to just move the king up into the center, it looks like. But, perhaps he didn't want to do that because the rook is lined up here. All right. So a few missed opportunities. We'll look at those in the analysis. And another mistake. So best would have been moving down here. Well, I don't know. If you move here, can the rook... Okay, I guess the rook can't move there because it'll be captured. You could chase the knight, but then the knight could just retreat back. All right, so a great move here. So this capture, computer really likes that. And... all right, so this game review, it kind of zipped through here. It's almost done. Nothing too big. Maybe a couple inaccuracies. All right, I'll just hurry up, get back to the beginning one more time here, and just take a look at some of these possibilities. All right, so... if you're still hanging in after the regular game playthrough and that quick game review, here at least we can look at things with the computer. So let me get into the moves. So d4, knight to f6. The bishop moves up. This is close. I guess this is an accelerated London system. And with this move, you leave the option open of possibly pushing to c4 if your opponent lets you. And then they played this unusual move here. All right, let me put the analysis up here. Where is that? Where is there we go. Okay, so the bishop move, computer like that, of course, because you already started to fianchetto. You have to complete the fianchetto. And then f3, the best move according to the computer, you know, blocking the scope of the bishop, helping cover e4. And now we have d5. That way, if e4 is played, you can kind of start attacking a little bit there. And the computer really liked this e4 move, but I don't know. If you're a Jabava London player, that's probably a little too early to be pushing that e-pawn up there. Instead, going after this, threatening the fork with the knight, so it forces this knight to a bad spot here on a6 to defend against that, and then we just continue with g4. So in the Jabava London, if you play f3, you have a good opportunity to just continue pushing forward with g4 and possibly h4 and a pawn storm on the king side. So e6 is played, helping release the dark squared bishop, and then e3. So these are more common Jabava London moves. You play e3 to help protect your bishop on f4 and back up your d pawn. So now c6 is played, kicking the knight back. So the knight just retreats back to c3, and now we have bishop to d6. Computer didn't like that as much as bishop to e7, so interestingly, it preferred this bishop to e7 move. And then what might you play? Computer recommends knight to h3, bishop to g3, or a3. All right, but knight to h3, and then where is that knight going then? Maybe jump up here, or could be repositioning here and then in towards the center possibly, or just moving to f2 to help cover the e4 square in case you want to push your pawn up to e4. All right, which a pawn push to e4 from e3 to e4, that's another theme in the Jabava London. So if they play c5, sometimes you'll capture that c pawn and then push your e pawn up to e4. So if the knight goes to h3 and then maybe back to f2, that might help with a pawn push to e4. So moving on. Let's see here. In the game, we had bishop to d6. So another very common theme. The bishops confront each other. Here Magnus plays queen to d2, which the computer didn't like. It wanted an immediate capture. But like I said, that would just help black develop their queen towards the center. So why not develop one of your pieces? Queen up to d2. That way, if the bishop captures your bishop, pawn would recapture and the queen would be guarding that pawn, the f pawn and the d pawn. So let's see here. They recommended the capture, and it says that move would keep white ahead, but black has a slight edge at this point. All right, continuing on. Queen to e7. The computer did not like that. It wanted a capture. But like I said, if they capture, you capture. Now you have this square e5 on lockdown. The computer recommends kingside castling here, but I don't know. That looks a little more dangerous since you have all these pawns that can storm up the king side. What's the other option? Knight to c7, which needs to happen as well. So let's get back to what happened in the game. Oh, another option might be if the bishop comes down here to um, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. I guess your queen could help guard that knight, or, probably you want to jump your knight up there to protect and cover the knight. All right, in the game, we had queen up to d2, another queen move by black, and then queen side castling. Computer prefers an immediate attack on this knight, but the knight would just probably retreat back to d7, and then it would kind of have an eye on c5 and e5 for a future pawn push. All right, so knight to c7, getting this knight out of the or off the edge of the board, relocating it towards the center. And let's see, computer once again wants that capture. So maybe the computer is a little confused in this Jabava London. So like I said, if the bishop captures white's bishop and the pawn recaptures, you have a good lockdown on this e5 square. So finally, white captures, and the computer says this is the best move now. So, the queen, because it's already moved, now you capture, and the queen just moves again. And now we have an attack in the center. So, because this queen is unprotected, if you could open up the center, there'd be an attack on the queen, but you're threatening a fork here as well. The computer actually likes this g5 move better. So, capture, recapture, the strong pawn center by Magnus Carlsen now. I see probably why the computer wanted that G pawn push first, because there's a threat of capturing. It looks like black can capture this pawn, but white would grab a slight edge. The best move appears to be c5. So that wasn't played. Instead, we have a queen retreat, which is a mistake. So let's look at this c5 move. So if that's played, what would be best here? D5. And, of course, you can't push forward now, or can you? Let's see what it says about that. But first, D5. Looks like D5 is the best move. Just pushing forward, capture, capture, and then you could recapture, I believe. I'll take a look at that. Well, let's look at that first. So this is what the computer wants. D5. Now they're saying bishop to G2 would have been better. Interesting, interesting. Here, just castle, and then G5 anyway. All right. Let me go back here. C5. If that is played, yeah, that wouldn't be good. If you played E5, the queen's under attack, but that queen can just retreat, and then you're left with an attack on the rook, and the rook's trapped in there. All right, let's see. Back to the game. Queen to E7. Finally, G5 is played, attacking the knight. Knight retreats, and let's see here. After further play, we have this move, bishop to H3, and the computer doesn't like that. It recommends an immediate capture there. So we could look at that. Capture. Then what? They want... They want the pawn capture instead of the rook capture. I guess giving you this open file. Well, they can fight for this. Now bishop to e2, getting the bishop off the back rank, and then a possible fight for this g file. And also the computer now wants queen to f4, also saying that would have been better. Okay, bishop to h3 occurred in the game. Pawns are exchanged. It looks like the computer wants that. But, Magnus probably he wasn't ready to trade off queens yet. This would just allow a queen trade. The knight can jump up here. Rook at f, or excuse me, rook at d to f8 would just stop that threat. Rook at f, or excuse me, rook at d to f1. You just add the pressure, and now what? Rook takes h4, capture, rook captures, rook captures. So, Magnus probably didn't want this big trade down of pieces. Let's see what happened in the game. Let me go back here. Go back a few moves. So, we had an exchange of pawns here. The king moves over because the bishop was lined up on it. Now the queen lines up on the king. Maybe puts pressure on this pawn in the future. So, that's probably why the computer wanted that pawn to move forward. And the knight jumps forward here. And now we have pawn push, capture, capture, and a knight retreat. So, continuing on. Looks like an inaccuracy here, bringing that knight forward and blocking. They actually wanted this move. Rook takes d4. Now, how does that work? Can the rook capture on d4? It looks like it. Oh, but then you would have a fork. Okay. A possible fork. So, instead the computer, well, it looks like it's all even here. An even game. Capture the rook. Or use the queen or knight to capture over here. So in the game, knight to g4. We have the knight getting off the back rank, moving forward a little bit to the black's second rank there. And now a pawn push, attacking the queen and pawn. So retreat, capture, capture, and the knights jump up to their outposts. And we have this attack on the rook as well. So this move was an inaccuracy. Better, looks like, would have been queen to f8. So it wants that move. Protecting both rooks. Then what? Rook capture, or doubling of the rooks. All right. Back to the game. So capture with check, recapture, and the queens are traded off, but the pawns are broken here. So the bishop repositions, getting out of the way of the rook as well. And then the game continues with another bishop repositioning, attacking the knight. So knight retreats. And we just have a lot of maneuvering here. All right, so a mistake. Now, what is the computer like? King to d6 instead. So if that occurred, what do we have? Multiple moves. Rook to h2, knight to f5 check, bishop to h3. So, maybe things were a little complicated here, and, the players were having a little trouble deciding what was best. Continuing on. Knight to g4. All right. Attack of the knight. It looks like it would have been better maybe to check the king up here. But the game continues with this knight move. Computer did not like that, so instead it prefers this move. Jumping forward, knight to f2. And then, what do they recommend? Knight to e3. Computer says that's the best move. Knight to e3. Now it's recommending bishop to e2. So, perhaps the computer is a little undecided as well on how the game should proceed. So, continuing on, we have here a great move by Carlsen, capturing. Now the pawns are blocking each other. It did kind of open up the scope of this rook a little bit. But Carlsen attacks again. With the bishop going after the knight jumps forward, rook checks, king comes forward, and now the computer recommends just taking that pawn. So why is that not played? Well, perhaps Magnus wanted to just restrict the king. So the king moves back, knight captures, but then we have the knight and rook targeting this c2 pawn. So moving forward, we have the knight jumping up here, forking the king and the protected knight. So king moves. This knight is ignored, but the bishop jumps down here to help protect. So the game continues with a repositioning of this knight, although computer prefers the rook coming up here, which kind of blocks the bishop in, but it would get the rook out of the way of this pawn, and prevent this pin here. So now we have a pin. The bishop is able to jump down here and protect the knight, though, to free up the rook. So, after some maneuvering, pawns are captured. And Magnus is just ahead here by +4 the computer says now, which is winning. And remember, this was a 3-minute blitz game. And look, there's only 6 seconds left on the clock for black. Yeah, so that has to be rough, running out of time like that. I have experience with that, having time trouble. All right, so the game continues here. An attack on the knight. Knight captures bishop. Pawn is captured. And then the knight jumps forward. An inaccuracy. Perhaps Magnus is moving a little bit quickly, trying to run his opponent out of time. Looks like it would have been better to just go ahead after the bishop. But we have a knight maneuver, trying to keep the pieces on the board probably, so his opponent would have to think a little bit more and wouldn't be able to move as quickly with less pieces to worry about on the board. So check, king moves up, and bishop to e2. Oh, really crazy. Only 2 seconds left on the clock. So the rook attacks here. Capture, capture, and king up to e5 with an attack. So after this rook moves, it looks like the Magnus's opponent must have run out of time here. So yeah, this must be the end of the game because his opponent just ran out of time. It looks like white is ahead by +2.73. So According to the computer, it looks like Magnus has chances to go on and win this endgame. But, how could it play out? It looks like rook to c1 is preferred. If the knight is captured, well then, the pawn can just capture moving forward. This king is kind of blocked out. Maybe we would have the rook moving over. And it's kind of tricky. Perhaps king and rook could target this pawn, and if they're traded off, white might still have this lone pawn here with this king protecting it and possibly able to escort it up. We could take a look at that. Let's see. What if you had a capture? Well, now the game, after this capture, jumps up. Yeah, perhaps. Let's see. So if you go there, what about that move? Well, now you have c5. Yeah, anyway, it looks tough for black. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that different variation with the fianchetto of the queen over, or excuse me, of the bishop over here. So, with this setup here, the Jabava-London system with knight to c3, pawn to d4, and bishop to f4, but we had an unusual queen side fianchetto of the bishop, which you probably won't see as much. So I hope you enjoyed that, seeing how Magnus handled that with this f3 pawn move to blunt the scope of that bishop. And it's always great to see games by Magnus Carlsen. So you should check out as many of his games as you can, because you can always learn a lot. All right, well, thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.